Sherlock Holmes and the Coffin that Knocked. From the Inside Chapter I. The letter, written in trembling ink. It was on a Thursday morning in the bitter third week of November, during one of those grey London fogs that reduced the city to a ghostly smear of gas lamp halos and shuffling silhouettes, that a letter arrived at 221B Baker Street, which would set in motion one of the most extraordinary cases I have ever had the privilege to record. I remember the morning with uncommon clarity, perhaps because it began so unremarkably. Holmes sprawled in his armchair in a dressing gown of faded burgundy, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling with the particular vacancy that I had learned to recognise not as idleness, but as the deepest form of concentration. 3 empty pipes lay on the side table beside him, their bowls cold and ashen. He had not spoken since breakfast, and breakfast had been untouched. I had settled myself near the fire with the morning edition of the Daily Telegraph, more for warmth than information, when Mrs. Hudson's knock preceded her entrance by the customary single beat. "A letter for Mr. Holmes," she said, setting it on the mantelpiece with the careful propriety of a woman long accustomed to handling correspondence of uncertain content. Delivered by hand, not post. The boy who brought it would not wait. Holmes did not stir. His eyes remained on the ceiling. "Leave it, Mrs. Hudson," I said. "I shall see if he receives it." When she had gone, I examined the envelope before placing it within Holmes's reach. It was of fine quality, cream-coloured, heavy stock, the sort used by persons of some means, but the address upon it had been written with unmistakable urgency. The pen had been pressed hard into the paper, and in several places the nib had dragged, leaving small tears in the surface. The letters were large but uneven, as though composed by a hand that shook not with age but with agitation. The ink was blue-black, and it had been blotted imperfectly, leaving a faint mirror smudge of the word Holmes across the inside flap. "Interesting," Holmes said, without moving. I had not spoken. I looked up to find that he had turned his head fractionally, one eye now directed at me rather than the ceiling. "You have been holding the envelope for 30 seconds, he continued. "You have turned it twice. From the angle of your wrist, you were examining the address rather than searching for a postmark, which tells me you have already noted there is none. You are about to tell me that whoever wrote it was in a state of considerable distress. You might simply read it," I said. "Hand it here, then." He broke the seal with a thumbnail and unfolded the single sheet within. I watched his face as he read, and it was a rare thing to observe any expression settle upon those angular features. But what I saw was not the mild interest that greeted most correspondence. His brow descended by the smallest fraction. His eyes moved through the text, once rapidly, and then again with deliberate care. "Watson," he said at last, "are you acquainted with the village of Harwick Hollow?" "I cannot say that I am. It lies some 43 miles to the southeast of London, in Kent. A small community, wool trade, historically, church that dates to the 13th century. And, as of 3 days ago, apparently a coffin that knocked from the inside." He held the letter out to me. "Read it, every word." The letter read as follows. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you in the most desperate state of mind I have ever known, and I beg you not to dismiss what I am about to describe as the fancy of a frightened woman. I am not a frightened woman. I am a frightened woman, with very specific and rational cause for fright, which is quite different. My name is Miss Eugenia Polwarth. I am 41 years of age, unmarried, and I have lived in Harwick Hollow all my life. I managed my late brother's estate, Polwarth House, for 6 years following the death of our father, and I am not given to imaginative disturbance. My brother, Mr. Cornelius Polwarth, died on the 14th of this month, ostensibly of a heart failure. He was buried 4 days later in the churchyard of St. Ambrose's, Harwick Hollow. He was 54 years old and, to my direct knowledge, had no history of heart trouble whatsoever. On the night of his burial, the sexton, a reliable man named Dobbins, tended those grounds for 20 years, heard, at approximately 10:30 in the evening, a sound from within the newly covered grave. He described it, when I pressed him, as a hollow, repetitive knocking, as of wood struck from inside. I know how this sounds. I know precisely how this sounds. But Cornelius was buried in a lead-lined casket, Mr. Holmes. Lead-lined. The cost of which he had specified in his own will. The knocking, if it came from the coffin, would have required considerable force to be audible through 3 feet of earth and a lid of that density. I have gone to the local constabulary. They have declined to act. I have gone to our vicar, Reverend Holst. He has suggested prayer. I am beyond prayer, Mr. Holmes. I am requesting science. Please come. Yours in desperation, Eugenia Polwarth, Polwarth House, Harwick Hollow, Kent. I set the letter down. The fire crackled. Outside, cart horse clattered through the fog. Well, I said. Indeed, said Holmes. He had already risen from his chair and was moving toward his bedroom. Pack a bag for 2 nights, Watson. We take the 9:47 from Cannon Street. He paused in the doorway. I have no opinion on the matter yet. I have only a great deal of curiosity. A woman of stated rationality, writing in genuine distress, describing a physically impossible event with precise technical detail. The specification of a lead-lined casket is particularly interesting, don't you think? She is not embellishing, she is presenting evidence. Pack warmly. November in Kent is disagreeable. He disappeared. I stood holding the letter for a moment longer, reading again the line about the knocking, and found, to my mild embarrassment, that the hairs on my forearms had risen. Chapter 2. A village that keeps its curtains drawn. The train from Cannon Street carried us through London's dissolving outskirts, and into the flat, grey-green countryside of Kent, with a rhythm that was almost meditative. Holmes did not speak for the first half-hour of the journey. He sat with his chin on one fist and watched the passing landscape with the expression, a man reading a text in a language he was still learning. I had brought the letter again and read it a 3rd time, attempting to extract something I had previously missed, but found nothing new. The handwriting was educated, the grammar precise, the tone, despite the extraordinary content, admirably controlled. She says he had no history of heart trouble, I remarked aloud, more to myself than to Holmes. She says she had no direct knowledge of heart trouble, Holmes corrected, without turning from the window. Distinction worth preserving. You think she may be wrong about his health? Think that people are frequently wrong about the health of those they love, and equally frequently correct about the health of those they resent. Polwarth managed his estate for 6 years. Whether she loved her brother or resented him is a question I intend to have answered before we have been in Harwick Hollow an hour. I considered this. You suspect her? I suspect everyone, Watson. Post. It is the only intellectually honest posture at the beginning of any investigation. Suspicion distributed evenly across all parties is not prejudice. It is method. He finally turned from the window. What struck you about the letter? I thought carefully before answering, having learned from long experience that Holmes's questions were rarely what they appeared. The technical specificity, I said. Lead-lined casket. She mentions it to explain why the knocking would have been difficult to hear, to preempt the sceptical argument that it might have been imagination. Good. What else? She mentions the sexton by name, Dobbins, as though she anticipated we might wish to speak to him, wanted to establish his credibility in advance. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Better. What does that tell you? That she has thought carefully about how to present her case. That she is a logical woman. It tells you something else as well. She names Dobbins as a reliable man of 20 years' service. But she does not tell us what she was doing at the churchyard that night, or whether she herself heard the knocking. Dobbins came to her with the story, or she was there and is omitting her own presence. Possibility is interesting. He settled back. We shall know more when we arrive. Harwick Hollow proved to be exactly as small as its name suggested. The station was a single platform with a wooden shelter and a station master who doubled as a porter. The village beyond was visible from the platform steps, a cluster of stone buildings around a market cross, Norman church tower, rising above a line of bare-branched elms, and beyond the church a grey sweep of common land that faded into fog. The whole place had the sealed, self-contained quality of villages that have been the same for 300 years, and intend to remain so. Trap had been sent to meet us, driven by an elderly man who introduced himself as Marsh, the Polwarth House groom. He was a lean, weather-seamed individual with the economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent decades in physical labour and see no reason to waste effort on conversation. Holmes, however, possessed a gift for extracting information from reticent people that bordered on the supernatural. By the time the trap had conveyed us up the half-mile lane from the village to the house, Holmes had, through a series of questions, so gently placed, they scarcely seemed like questions at all, established the following. Cornelius Polwarth had died alone in his study at approximately 8:30 in the evening that the doctor summoned. A local man named Fenwick had arrived within 40 minutes and pronounced death by cardiac failure, that the deceased had received no visitors on the day of his death. That he had, however, received a visitor the day before. A gentleman from London, named Marsh did not know, but whose appearance he described as sharp-looking, in good clothes, not a friend, and that Miss Eugenia Polwarth had been in the village when her brother died, having gone to the post office that afternoon, and had returned to find him already dead. "Thank you, Marsh," Holmes said as we drew up before the house. His tone was entirely conversational, as though they had merely been discussing the weather. Polwarth House was a solid Jacobean building of local stone, its facade darkened by centuries of English damp. It was not large by the standards of a country house, but it had the settled, praetorial look of a building that knew its own value. Several of the windows were curtained despite the midday hour. Miss Eugenia Polwarth met us at the door herself. She was a tall woman, angular in the way of people who have been thin all their lives, and are not apologetic about it. Dark hair was threaded with silver and drawn back with severe precision. Her face was strong-featured, handsome, even, but hollowed by what I judged to be not so much grief as sustained, sleepless anxiety. She wore black, as was proper, but it was a functional black, a working mourning, rather than the elaborate creep of fashionable grief. "Mr. Holmes," she said. Voice was steady. Her eyes, however, moved to assess us both, with a quickness that confirmed everything her letter had suggested about her character. "And this will be Dr. Watson. Please come in. I have been watching the lane since 11. The interior was dark-panelled, comfortable without being lavish, and smelled of beeswax and old paper." She led us to a sitting-room where a fire had been freshly built, sat across from us without waiting for an invitation, her hands folded in her lap with visible effort. "You came," she said. "I was not certain you would." "The case presents features of interest," Holmes said. "Before we discuss them, require plain answers to plain questions. You will oblige me by not editorializing." She blinked once. "I will try. Your brother died on the 14th. You were absent from the house. When did you last see him alive?" "That morning, at breakfast. We spoke briefly about household accounts." "Were relations between you cordial?" A pause. "Fractional, but present. We were not close in the way of some siblings. We had different characters, but there was no great quarrel between us." And yet you managed his estate for 6 years. That implies either trust or necessity. It implies that he was a man who disliked administrative detail, and I am a woman who is good at it. It was an arrangement of mutual convenience. Holmes nodded. The visitor from London, the day before his death, who was he? Miss Polwarth's composure, which had been admirable, shifted by the smallest degree. Not a flinch, more the quality of a lamp flame when a door opened somewhere in the house. His name was Mr. Gerald Ashby, she said. A solicitor. Your brother's solicitor? No, a solicitor retained by certain creditors of my brother's. Cornelius had debts, Mr. Holmes. Debts which I had not been fully informed of until recently. How recently? Since his death? Since Mr. Ashby's visit, in fact. It appears Cornelius had been borrowing against the estate for 3 years, and had not informed me. Steadiness of her voice was, I realised, not calm. It was controlled fury, very precisely managed. I found this out the morning after the burial. Mr. Ashby wrote to me. And the estate, Polwarth House, the land, is now encumbered, substantially. She lifted her chin. But that is not what I came to you about. I came to you about the knocking. We shall come to the knocking, Holmes said. First tell me about Dr. Fenwick. Chapter 3, The Doctor's Unsteady Diagnosis, Doctor. Raymond Fenwick occupied a practice on the eastern edge of Harwick Hollow, in a house that managed, despite its modest proportions, poured to convey an air of comfortable professional authority. Holmes had insisted on calling upon him that same afternoon, before we had even taken our rooms at the village's single inn. A reasonable establishment called the Ploughman's Rest. Landlord regarded our arrival with the particular suspicion that small villages reserve for strangers in November. Fenwick himself was a man of approximately 55, broad-shouldered and genial in appearance, with the ruddy complexion of someone who walks a great deal outdoors, and a grey moustache that he had apparently been cultivating since the reign of previous monarch. He received us in his consulting room with every mark of hospitality, offering sherry which Holmes declined, and I accepted, settling back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who expects no difficulty from any quarter. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with evident curiosity, "I read about you in the papers from time to time. I confess I did not expect to see you in Harwick Hollow. Polwarth business, I take it?" "It is," said Holmes. "You certified the cause of death as cardiac failure." "I did. Entirely straightforward, afraid. The heart simply stopped. It happens. In a man of 54 with no prior history of cardiac disease." Fenwick spread his hands. "Mr. Holmes, cardiac events are the great unpredictables of medicine. A man may have no prior symptoms and still suffer a catastrophic episode. The state of Mr. Polwarth's heart at the time of his death was entirely consistent with a natural failure. I examined him thoroughly." "How thoroughly?" I asked, with the professional interest that the statement invited. Fenwick glanced at me with mild surprise, though he had not expected the question from that direction. "I am a practitioner of 30 years' experience, Dr. Watson." "That was not the question," Holmes said pleasantly. Dr. Watson asked how thoroughly. "The extent of the post-mortem examination, specifically." Brief pause. "There was no formal post-mortem. There was no indication requiring one. Body presented with the classic signs of cardiac failure. Cyanosis, absence of vital signs, no evidence of external trauma. I examined him for the better part of an hour." "The better part of an hour," Holmes repeated, as though committing the phrase to memory. "And did you note the condition of the hands?" Fenwick's expression became very slightly guarded. It was not an obvious change. A man of lesser observational habit would have missed it entirely. But I saw the minute tightening at the corners of his eyes. "The hands," he said. "I observed the general condition of the extremities, yes, and found nothing remarkable, nothing that bore upon the question of cause of death." Holmes leaned forward by a precise inch. "Dr. Fenwick, Post, I am going to ask you a direct question. And I would appreciate the candour which I suspect your professional ethics actually demand, but which social comfort tempts you to avoid. Were there any marks or abrasions upon the fingertips or the palms of Cornelius Polwarth's hands?" The silence that followed this question was not long, perhaps 4 seconds. But in those 4 seconds I watched a comfortable, confident man make a decision about how much of what he knew he was prepared to share with a stranger. "There were some superficial marks," Fenwick said at last, "on the palms principally. I attributed them to his work in the garden. He was a keen horticulturalist." "In November," Holmes said. "He had a glass house, I see." Holmes rose. "One final question. Who requested that the coffin be lead-lined? Was it a provision of the will, as Miss Polwarth believes, or was it specified by another party?" Fenwick stood as well. Something in his bearing had shifted. The easy authority was still present. But underneath it, now, was something more careful, more watchful. "The will specified it, as I understand." "You understand. You were not present when the will was read." "I was not. I am the man's doctor, not his solicitor." "Quite so. Thank you for your time." Holmes moved to the door, then turned back, with the air of a man who has just remembered something minor. "One thing more. Where is Mr. Polwarth currently interred? Precise location in the churchyard. The eastern plot. The family section. Beneath the copper beech." Fenwick paused. "Why?" "Curiosity," said Holmes, and smiled and left. Outside, in the thin grey afternoon air, fell into step beside Holmes as he moved toward the churchyard with the unhurried, precise gait of a man who knows exactly where he is going. "The hands," I said. "Yes. You think they were not garden abrasions. I think that a man who knows he has had his death arranged for him finds himself still alive inside a sealed container, will, if he has any fight remaining, beat against the lid with his hands until they bleed." Holmes paused at the churchyard gate, his eyes moving across the rows of stones toward the copper beech at the eastern boundary. "Question that now occupies me, Watson, is not whether Cornelius Polwarth was alive when he was buried. I believe he was. The question is whether whoever placed him in that coffin knew he was alive, or merely hoped he was dead." I stared at him. Fog was thickening around the stones. "The two possibilities imply very different crimes," I said slowly. "They do. One implies murder by premature burial. Deliberate, premeditated, and extraordinarily cold-blooded. Plot. The other implies a conspiracy to fake death and bury a living man who was expected to revive, perhaps after some drug had worn off, in which case the motive is concealment rather than killing." He pushed open the gate. "Let us go and look at the grave." Chapter 4. What the sexton remembered. The grave of Cornelius Polwarth was a rectangle of raw, recently turned earth beneath the copper beech, bordered by a temporary wooden marker that would eventually be replaced by stone. Beech's bare branches spread above it like a pensively open hand. It was, in every visible respect, ordinary fresh grave in an English country churchyard. And yet standing before it in the fading afternoon, Holmes crouched at its edge, examining the disturbed soil with a lens. I felt an unease that I could not entirely attribute to the atmospheric conditions. The sexton, Dobbins, found us there. He was a stout man of about 60, with a broad weathered face of fundamental honesty, the kind of face that finds it physically difficult to prevaricate. He had been pointed in our direction by the vicar, Reverend Holst, a pale young clergyman who had told us with visible discomfort that he had heard nothing unusual on the night of the burial, and was not entirely sure he wished to pursue inquiries that might be, theologically, vexing. Dobbins, by contrast, appeared relieved to speak to someone who showed no sign of dismissing his account. "It was 10:30, he told us. standing a respectful distance from the grave while Holmes continued his examination of the perimeter. I was doing my evening round, checking gates, making sure the Hargreaves candles were out. They sometimes leave them burning. That family, don't know why. And I come along the eastern path here, and I hear it. Describe it exactly, Holmes said, not looking up. Hollow, like, regular, not frantic, more like. Dobbins paused, searching for the word. Like someone knocking on a door to be let in. Patient-like, if you understand me. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Pattern, I said. Aye, that's what made me stop. A random noise I might have put down to a branch or an animal, but it had a rhythm to it. Stood there a good 2 minutes listening. How loud? Holmes asked. Not loud. If I hadn't been quiet and close, I'd never have heard it. Carried. The ground here is chalk under the topsoil. That makes sound travel differently. And what did you do? Dobbins shifted his weight. I'll tell you honest, Mr. Holmes. I ran. I'm not a man of weak nerves as a rule. Laid out more bodies than I can count in 40 years of this work. But hearing it, clear as I hear you now. I thought of all the dead I'd put in this ground, and I ran like a child. He paused. I'm not proud of it. You did exactly as any sensible man would have done, Holmes said, with a gentleness that surprised even me. He rose from his crouch, pocketing his lens. When you returned in the morning, was the grave undisturbed? Entirely. Same as I'd left it after the burial. No fresh depressions? No tool marks on the surface? Nah. And had anyone else been in the churchyard that evening, to your knowledge? Dobbins hesitated. It was a brief hesitation, but Holmes caught it with the unerring speed of a man whose entire professional existence depended on catching exactly such pauses. Think carefully, Holmes said quietly. There was someone, Dobbins said at last, earlier in the evening, before I did my round. About 8 o'clock. A man standing by the gate at the western entrance. I only saw him from a distance. He moved off when he noticed me. I couldn't describe him well. Medium height, dark coat. He moved off. In which direction? Toward the lane that leads up to Polwarth House. Holmes looked at the grave for a long moment. Then he turned to me. Watson, he said, how long do you estimate a man of healthy constitution, provided he had been in some drug-induced state that had been mistaken for death, might survive inside a lead-lined coffin buried at standard depth? I calculated carefully. In terms of air supply, assuming minimal physical exertion, perhaps 4 to 6 hours. Under-exertion, considerably less. He died then. If he was alive when placed in the ground, he died before morning. Holmes's voice was without inflection. The question of whether the coffin should now be opened is one for Miss Polwarth and the authorities. Our concern is with the living. He turned back to Dobbins. Who in this village knew Cornelius Polwarth well? Personally, not merely by acquaintance, Dobbins thought. Miss Eugenia, of course. Old Marsh, the groom. He'd been with the family 40 years, Dr. Fenwick, Mr. Roper at the solicitors in the village. Handled the family affairs locally. And, he stopped, and the woman, the one who used to come to see him. Holmes became very still. What woman? I don't know her name. She came 3-4 times over the last year. Carriage from the station. Stayed no more than an hour or 2. The last time was, he thought, perhaps a fortnight before he died. What did she look like? Young, 30 perhaps, or a little over, dark hair, well dressed. I only saw her twice myself, but Mrs. Dobbins saw her once close to, in the lane. I should like to speak to Mrs. Dobbins, Holmes said. Chapter V. The solicitor's reluctant honesty, Mr. Roper's office occupied 2 rooms above a wool merchant's on the village high street, and Mr. Roper himself occupied them with the slightly nervous energy of a small-town professional who knows that the cases that come through his door are unlikely to call for anything more demanding than the conveyancing of cottages. and is consequently unprepared when they do. He was a slight, precise man of about 45, with the careful dress and the cautious manner of someone who has spent his career around documents of legal consequence and absorbed their quality. He shook Holmes's hand with the slightly excessive firmness of a man compensating for anxiety. "I expected this visit," he said, sitting down behind a desk that was notably tidy. "When I heard you had come to the village, Mr. Holmes." "Then we need not waste time on preliminaries," Holmes said pleasantly. "Cornelius Polwarth's estate, the will, tell me about it." Puh, cleared his throat. "The will was drawn up 4 years ago by my predecessor in this office. I inherited the file when old Mr. Carus retired. Mr. Polwarth never saw fit to revise it, to my knowledge. The provision regarding the lead-lined coffin, yes, that was in the will. Unusual provision, but not unheard of. Some people have a particular dread of premature burial." He said the phrase with the slight flinch of a man who now found it more freighted than it had previously been. "Quite. And the beneficiaries?" Roper looked at his hands. "The estate passes to Miss Eugenia Polwarth in its entirety, which is, as I am sure you are aware, an estate that now carries substantial debt." "Did you know about the debt during Mr. Polwarth's lifetime?" "I did not. The borrowing was conducted through a London firm, not through me. I was not in Mr. Polwarth's confidence regarding his financial arrangements, it appears. A trace of professional wounded pride beneath the careful neutrality. The London solicitor, Ashby, did you know him?" "By reputation only. A competent man. He acts for several of the larger creditors." Roper paused. "May I ask you something, Mr. Holmes?" "You may. Do you believe that Cornelius Polwarth was? That is, do you believe the sexton's account? That there was something that he was not?" "I believe the sexton heard exactly what he says he heard," Holmes replied. "I am attempting to determine what caused it." He leaned forward. "Mr. Roper, in your honest assessment, setting aside professional discretion for the moment, which I appreciate is a significant request, was there any person in this village, or connected to this village, clear material reason to benefit from the death of Cornelius Polwarth?" Roper was quiet for a moment that stretched to nearly half a minute. It was not the silence of someone concealing information, I thought, but of someone conducting an honest internal audit. "The debts," he said finally, "were not the only complication. There was a matter I only recently became aware of. It appears that Mr. Polwarth had, some time ago, made a secondary arrangement, a codicil of sorts, though not one formally recorded, with any solicitor. I found a letter among the estate papers, a letter from Mr. Polwarth to a party I have not been able to identify, promising a substantial sum upon his death, contingent on certain conditions." He opened a desk drawer and produced a folded document, considered whether to share this with Miss Polwarth. I had not yet decided. Holmes took the letter. I leaned to read it beside him. It was not long, written in a firm, deliberate hand. Very different from Miss Polwarth's agitated correspondence to us, it read, "Want, when the matter is concluded, and the arrangement has been successfully discharged. The sum of £1,200, held in trust at Marsden & Co., Fleet Street, London, shall be released to the party indicated. The password for release is the Copper Beech. This is binding in honour, if not in law." There was no salutation, there was no signature, but beneath it, in different ink and what appeared to be a different hand, was written a single word, "Understood." Holmes studied it for a long time, then folded it and placed it in his breast pocket. "I am taking this," he said. "You will receive a receipt. Do not mention it to anyone until I tell you otherwise." He stood. "One more question. When was this discovered?" "Among the estate papers delivered to me after the death. I could not date the letter itself." "The ink," Holmes said, "type that has only been commercially available in England for the last 2 years. The letter is recent." "Thank you, Mr. Roper." Outside, the fog had thickened to the point where the far end of the high street was entirely invisible. Holmes walked quickly, his coat collar up, his eyes already elsewhere. £1,200, I said. For what service? For the successful discharge of an arrangement, Holmes said. The arrangement, Watson, is the question. And the copper beech is the answer to something. I am not yet certain what. He stopped walking abruptly and turned to look back at the churchyard, whose gate was just visible through the mist. The copper beech, he said again, quietly, directly above the grave. Chapter Viggs, the woman in the dark coat Mrs. Dobbins, proved to be a more forthcoming witness than her husband in one particular respect. She had a sharp eye for the details of appearance that Sexton Dobbins, a man whose professional attention ran to the earth rather than its visitors, had entirely missed. She received us in a cottage kitchen that smelled magnificently of bread and wood smoke, wiping her hands on an apron and looking at Holmes with the composed interest of a woman not easily impressed, but not disinclined to engage. "The woman I saw in the lane," she said before Holmes had fully framed the question, "was not local. Her clothes were London clothes, not showy, but cut well. She had what my mother would have called a composed face. Not cold, exactly. More like someone who has taught themselves to be very careful about what they show." "Her age?" Holmes asked. 30 to 35, I'd say. With some people it's hard to tell. She had one of those faces that might be older and looking after itself, or younger and had difficult times. Her hair, you said, was dark, very dark. Brown or black, the light wasn't good. She wore it up. She had. This sounds like a small thing. She had very good posture. The kind you don't get from paying attention but from how you were raised. Holmes nodded. "Did she speak to you?" "She did not. She was getting into the carriage, the one that was waiting for her on the lane when I came by. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything. But she had been on the Polwarth Drive, coming out of it. Did she appear agitated? Hurried? Not hurried, thoughtful. Like someone who had just received news they had been expecting but still found not pleasant when it arrived." Mrs. Dobbins considered her own description, and appeared satisfied with it, and this was approximately a fortnight before the death. About that, yes. Holmes thanked her with the sincerity he reserved for witnesses who had given him something genuinely useful, and we walked back to the ploughman's Rest, through a dark that had descended well before 5 o'clock, fog now carrying a chill that bit through even my heavy coat. "A woman of education and self-control," I said. "Connected to Polwarth somehow. Connected to the letter in my pocket," Holmes said. The second hand, the one that wrote understood, was a woman's hand. The U has a small, characteristic curve at the bottom of the left stroke that is almost exclusively seen in the handwriting of women educated in a certain type of finishing school in the 1880s. I noticed it, but did not mention it to Roper. I stopped walking. "Holmes, you believe she is a party to whatever was arranged?" "I believe she is at minimum the person to whom the £1,200 was promised. Whether she is a confederate or a victim depends on a question I cannot yet answer." He turned up the collar of his coat against the damp. "There is a further consideration. The man at the churchyard gate, seen by Dobbins at 8 o'clock, before the knocking was heard at 10:30, was waiting, watching. If he was there to confirm that the burial had taken place, that is one thing. If he was there to ensure that no one came near the grave before a certain hour, that is quite another. What could possibly require someone to wait near a grave for a certain hour?" Holmes looked at me in the dark. His expression was, I now realised, not merely curious. It was troubled, and Holmes was a man whom very little genuinely troubled. "If the arrangement was not murder at all," he said slowly, "but escape." Chapter 7. The ghost in the account. Books Holmes spent the next morning at Polwarth House with the estates. Account books. A privilege. Miss Polwarth, granted with somewhat more trust than I thought the circumstances warranted. Although in retrospect, Holmes later observed, she had already made the decision to trust him before we arrived, or she would not have written. I accompanied him, less for any contribution I imagined myself making than because I was reluctant to leave him alone in a house whose history was growing daily more complicated. The account books were kept in the study where Cornelius Polwarth had died, a well-appointed room lined with shelves of natural history volumes, and featuring a substantial mahogany desk, at which, according to Miss Polwarth, her brother had spent the greater part of each day. Holmes sat at this desk and worked through the books with a systematic thoroughness that excluded conversation. While I examined the room itself, I found nothing obviously remarkable. The desk's surface was clean, cleared after the death, presumably. The chair behind it was positioned slightly askew, which Polwarth confirmed was not its usual position. The police constable, who had been summoned after the death, had moved it. The fireplace held a grate of old ash, including several scraps of partially burned paper that could no longer be read. The windows looked out over the frost-silvered garden. After 2 hours, Holmes set down the last book and sat back. He had been systematically withdrawing funds, he said, not borrowing against the estate, or rather, not only borrowing. For the last 18 months, he has been liquidating smaller investments, converting them to cash, and the cash does not appear in the estate accounts. It was being accumulated somewhere else. That supports the debt story, I said. It contradicts it, Holmes replied. Men who are sinking into debt do not simultaneously accumulate hidden cash. They spend it. Pattern here is of a man who was preparing. He rose. He was preparing to disappear, Watson. He had debts, yes. But those debts may themselves have been part of the arrangement. If a man of means wishes to vanish and leave nothing worth pursuing, he first encumbers everything he owns with debt. His creditors inherit his obligations. His apparent estate is worthless. No one searches very hard for a dead man who left nothing. The full implication settled over the room like the fog outside. The lead-lined coffin, I said, was in the will. A will drawn up 4 years ago. He had been planning this for 4 years, Watson. Holmes moved to the window. He had been considering it. The actual decision may have been more recent. But the coffin provision, that was the key mechanism. Lead-lined coffin would survive exhumation. It would muffle sounds more effectively. It would also, and this is the critical point, be more difficult to open quickly from the inside. Which is why the knocking was methodical rather than frantic. He was not in a panic, following a plan. He expected to be retrieved. By the person waiting at the churchyard gate. Yes. Who did not come? Who did not come? Holmes's voice was very quiet. I sat down because the room suddenly required it. He died there. He died waiting for someone who either could not, or chose not, to come for him. Holmes turned from the window, and that person, whether through fear, or change of heart, or some external obstruction, is now the only living individual who knows the truth of what was arranged. Find that person, and we find the answer to everything. Miss Polwarth's voice came from the doorway. Neither of us had heard her approach. Mr. Holmes, she said, you have just described my brother as a man who staged his own death to escape his creditors and abandon his responsibilities. Her voice was perfectly level. Are you telling me that the man I have spent 6 years managing an estate for, the man I have spent the last fortnight mourning, may not be dead at all? Holmes looked at her steadily. I am telling you that there is a possibility your brother is dead, and that it is possible. His death was the result of a plan that went wrong, rather than a murder that went right. I cannot yet tell you which. He paused. I need to know about the woman who visited him. Miss Polwarth was silent for a moment. Then she sat down, very carefully, chair beside the door. Her name, she said, is Mrs. Violet Carew. Chapter Vi. The name that opens doors, Mrs. Violet Carew. Holmes had me repeat it, to be certain I had it correctly, and then he did something I had not seen him do in some years. He closed his eyes, pressed his fingertips together, and was silent for a full 60 seconds. When he opened his eyes, there was in them the particular brightness that I associated with a mechanism falling precisely into place. I know that name, he said, Miss Polwarth, who had been watching him with the watchful composure of someone trying to determine whether the specialist they have summoned is a genius or a charlatan, shifted slightly. You know her? I know of her. She does not appear in any criminal record, but she has appeared, tangentially, in 3 cases that have passed through my awareness in the last 2 years. She is, or was, the widow of a maritime insurance adjuster named Carew, died in 1892 under circumstances that were called natural, and which I have occasionally doubted. She has subsequently lived well, moved in educated circles, and has been involved, I believe, in at least 2 transactions of a financial nature that were of questionable legitimacy, could not be prosecuted. He looked at Miss Polwarth. How did your brother know her? I do not know how they met. I became aware of her existence approximately 8 months ago, when I found a letter from her in his correspondence. A letter which was, on its surface, entirely innocent. A social communication. But my brother was not a man with many social connections, certainly not with women of that sort. What sort? The sort who are charming and intelligent, and whose connection to any given situation is always precisely as visible as they wish it to be, and no more. Miss Polwarth said this with the precision of a woman who has thought carefully about how to describe another and has chosen accuracy over generosity. Did you speak to your brother about her? I asked once who she was. He told me she was the widow of an old acquaintance and that I need not concern myself. He was not often abrupt with me, but he was abrupt about that. Holmes nodded slowly. Miss Polwarth, I need to go to London. There are inquiries I must make, which cannot be conducted from Harwick Hollow. I will return tomorrow evening. In my absence, I would ask you to do one thing. Yes, do not speak to Dr. Fenwick. If he calls, find a reason to be unavailable. Something moved across her face. Not surprise, exactly, but the recognition that confirms a suspicion long held. You think he is involved. Think he certified a cause of death that may be incorrect, and that his examination of the hands was less thorough than his experience demands. Whether that is incompetence, fear, or complicity, I cannot yet say. Holmes stood. Watson will remain here. I shall take the evening train. And so, for the second evening in Harwick Hollow, I found myself at the Ploughman's Rest without Holmes, which was a condition I had never found entirely comfortable. The village felt, in his absence, smaller and more threatening, as though the fog that pressed against the inn windows was not merely weather, but some quality of the place itself, something secretive and patient, waiting for the last piece to be removed. I dined alone, wrote notes on the day's discoveries, and retired early. And I was woken at 2 o'clock in the morning by the sound of something I had not expected and could not immediately identify. It was, I realised as I surfaced from sleep, the sound of a carriage on the village street below, a carriage moving at considerable speed for the hour, heading not toward the station but away from it. Toward Polwarth House. Chapter 9's. The second visitor I dressed in darkness, quickly as a man of my years and the hour allowed, and made my way down the inn stairs and out into a night so fog-thick that the carriage's rear lamp, already some 200 yards along the lane, was barely a smear of orange light. I am not given to precipitate action. Holmes had left me in Harwick Hollow, with an implicit commission to observe, and a carriage, calling at Polwarth House at 2 in the morning, seemed precisely the sort of observation worth making. Followed the lamp at as much of a run as the dark road and my dignity permitted. Polwarth House, when I reached the drive, had a single light burning in the downstairs study, the room where Cornelius Polwarth had died. The carriage stood at the front door, its horse blowing steam into the night air, the driver a motionless dark shape on the box. The front door itself stood open. I hesitated at the edge of the drive, calculating the relative merits of announcing myself and remaining concealed. Holmes, I knew, chosen concealment. I moved to the side of the house, beneath the study window. The voices inside were not raised, but in the silence of the country night they were quite audible. The first voice was Miss Polwarth's, tight, controlled, an undercurrent of shock. "You cannot be here if anyone sees you." The second voice was a woman's, low, clear, precision of diction that confirmed Mrs. Dobbins's assessment. Educated, self-controlled, and at this moment very deliberately measured. I need to know what the consulting detective has found. Out. Everything. He was here today. He knows about you. He knows your name. A silence. When the woman spoke again, the control was still there, but something behind it had shifted. He cannot know about the arrangement. He cannot know about the money. He found the letter. Another silence, longer this time. "Then I need to leave England," the woman said. "Mrs. Carew. Listen to me carefully, Miss Polwarth. What happened was not what was agreed. I want you to understand that. The arrangement was." A pause, and in the pause I heard something I had not expected. Genuine distress, working its way up through the layers of control. The arrangement was that he would be retrieved. I had a man in place. He was reliable, or I believed him to be reliable. Something prevented him. I do not know what. I arrived in the village at midnight. I had been on the road since 8 o'clock that evening, and when I reached the churchyard, her voice stopped entirely for a moment. "When I reached the churchyard," she continued more quietly, "I could hear nothing, and I could not." The composure was cracking now, in a way that was not performance. I was not strong enough. I could not have moved the earth alone. I sent for help. By the time help came, he was gone. Miss Polwarth's voice had changed. The stiffness had left it. "I tried," Mrs. Carew said. "Want you to believe that." I remained below the window for a further 10 minutes, until the carriage finally moved away into the fog. Then I went back to the inn, sat at the small writing desk in my room, and wrote out everything I had heard before the details could blunt themselves on sleep. In the morning I sent a telegram to Holmes in London. His reply arrived at noon. "Everything confirmed. Return tonight. Do not let her leave the village." H. Chapter X. What Holmes found in London. Holmes arrived on the last train that evening looking, for a man who had spent 24 hours in London, in November, remarkably alert. He settled into the chair, across from me in the inn's private parlour, accepted a whisky, and delivered his findings with the focused economy of a man who has sorted through a great deal of material, and kept only what matters. "Violet Carew," he began. "Widow, as known, well educated. Her father was a professor of natural philosophy at Edinburgh. She married Carew in 1889, 3 years before his death. No children. After his death, she lived modestly for 2 years, then very comfortably for the next 5. The source of the comfort is not, in any official record, accounted for." "The insurance," I suggested. "Maritime insurance adjusters do not leave wealth. Watson, they are paid to reduce the payment of it." "No." The source was Cornelius Polwarth. Found the account at Marsden and Co., the firm mentioned in the letter. It was opened 4 years ago. Deposits irregular, the intervening period. The total at the time of Polwarth's death, Just under £4,000. 4,000, he said 1,200. The 1,200 was the promised fee. The remainder was, I believe, the accumulated stake of Cornelius Polwarth's escape fund. He had been routing money to Marsden and Co. through Mrs. Carew for 4 years, and she had been managing it. The arrangement was not merely an extraction scheme. It was a financial partnership. She handled his money. He provided the capital, and when the time came, they would both leave England together. I absorbed this. She was his. What? His partner? His confederate? Both and more. Think. The relationship was not purely commercial. Holmes set down his glass. I made inquiries at several addresses in London that Mrs. Carew has occupied over the last 4 years. She left her most recent address 6 days ago, the day after Polwarth's burial. She took very little with her. She is in Harwick Hollow. Holmes looked up sharply. What? I told him what I had heard beneath the study window. He listened with an entirely still face, and eyes that grew steadily brighter as the account progressed. She came back, he said, when I had finished. She came back to explain herself to Miss Polwarth. Why? Guilt, perhaps, or fear. If she suspects that Holmes of Breaker Street has been retained and is investigating, she may be calculating that voluntary transparency is safer than being found. She is an intelligent woman. She knows that the evidence connecting her to the arrangement will eventually be found. He was quiet for a moment. She said the man she had in place was reliable, but something prevented him. Who was the man at the churchyard gate? Someone she employed to retrieve Polwarth, and who apparently was himself prevented or deterred. Holmes stood, moving to the window. Watson, do you know what has been troubling me since this morning, when I found the full financial picture? Tell me. The timing. Polwarth chose to stage his death at a moment when his creditors were pressing him. That is the obvious motive. But the specific moment, the 14th of November, was not chosen at random. The creditor's representative, Ashby, visited the day before. Polwarth knew that within days his financial situation would become public and potentially actionable. He needed to move immediately. Holmes turned from the window. But here is what troubles me. Ashby visited the day before. The death occurred the following evening. Dr. Fenwick was summoned and certified the death with unusual haste. The burial was rapid, 3 days after death, unusually quick. Someone arranged for this to proceed with remarkable efficiency. Someone with local influence. Fenwick, I said. Fenwick was complicit in the certification, yes. But he would not have had the authority to rush the burial. Person who would have authority to make all of those arrangements with minimal friction is the person responsible for the estate. He looked at me steadily. Miss Eugenia Polwarth. I stared at him. She knew, Holmes said. Question is whether what she knew was the plan to fake the death, or only that her brother wished to disappear, not understanding the full mechanism. And the further question is whether she is protecting herself, her brother's memory, or Mrs. Carew. He finished his whiskey and set down the glass with the precise finality of a man who has found the shape of the thing. Tomorrow, he said, we bring them all together. Chapter 11. Fenwick Confesses. Half of it Holmes visited Dr. Fenwick at 8 o'clock the next morning, an hour chosen, I suspected, with deliberate intent, being early enough that the doctor would not have had time to compose himself, and late enough that he could not claim illness as an excuse to refuse us. I accompanied Holmes with the awareness that things were moving toward some kind of culmination, though I could not precisely predict the form it would take. Fenwick answered the door himself in shirt and sleeves and braces, and his face, when he saw Holmes, was the face of a man who had been expecting a visit, and had nevertheless hoped it would not come. You had better come in, he said. In the consulting room, he did not offer sherry this time. He sat down heavily in the chair behind his desk and looked at his hands for a moment before speaking. "I suppose you know," he said. "I know that you examined Cornelius Polwarth and found him in a state that was not death," Holmes said. "I know that you certified death regardless. I would like you to tell me the rest." Fenwick looked up. His expression had settled into something that was not quite resignation, and not quite relief. The expression of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long, and has decided that dropping it, whatever the consequences, preferable to continuing. "He was not dead," Fenwick said. "He was in a profound unconscious state, a drug-induced torpor of a kind I had never personally seen, but had read about. The pulse was barely detectable, the respiration was almost nothing, the temperature had dropped significantly. To a cursory examination, the presentation was identical to death." "But yours was not a cursory examination," Holmes said. "No." Fenwick's voice was flat with self-contempt. "I found the pulse. Faint, very faint, but present. I found the breathing. Found the warmth of the skin was not entirely absent. I knew he was alive, and you certified him dead. He had asked me to. 6 months ago, he came to me and told me what he intended. I told him it was dangerous, immoral, and that I would have nothing to do with it. He told me he understood, and left, and then 3 weeks later he showed me documents." Fenwick closed his eyes briefly. "I have a son, Mr. Holmes. He made an imprudent investment some years ago, which I assisted him with using money that was not entirely mine to use. Money was from patient trust accounts. A temporary loan, I told myself. It was not temporary. Polwarth knew this. He had found out. I do not know how. He told me that in exchange for my cooperation, the documents would be destroyed. If I refused, he would use them." Fenwick's hands had closed into fists on the desk. "I told myself that no real harm would come of it, that it was a victimless fraud, post, that he would be retrieved before the drug wore off, and the whole business would end with him living quietly somewhere under another name. Hands, I said. The abrasions." Fenwick nodded, not looking at me. "The drug wore off faster than calculated. He was. When I saw him at the chapel, before the coffin was sealed, still deeply insensate. But the timing was tighter than intended. I believe the drug began to wear off shortly after burial. That is why Dobbins heard what he heard." A pause. "Thought about it every night since." "Who calculated the drug dosage?" Holmes asked. "Mrs. Carew provided it. She had the pharmaceutical knowledge. Her father, apparently, had done research in this area. She and Polwarth had worked out the timing together." Fenwick looked up. "I did not know who was to retrieve him. I was only told there was a plan. And when no one came, the next morning the grave was undisturbed. You said nothing. What could I say? I had certified the death. If I came forward, I destroyed myself without necessarily saving him. By morning, I knew it was too late." His voice had dropped to nearly nothing. "I have lived with that." Holmes was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was neither merciful nor harsh. It was simply accurate. "You will be required to give a full statement," he said. "You will also be required to assist in the formal exhumation, which I am arranging through Lestrade's office in London. Your honesty now may influence the extent of the consequences. I make no promises, neither will I misrepresent your cooperation." Fenwick nodded slowly, as though a weight had shifted on his shoulders, not lifted, redistributed into something he could at last face directly. Chapter 12. Holmes lays the trap. The arrangement that Holmes made for the afternoon of our third day in Harwick Hollow was characteristic of him in its simplicity of form and its complexity of purpose. He sent 3 separate notes, each conveying a version of the same essential message, that he had reached certain conclusions and wished to share them before acting on them. To Miss Eugenia Polwarth, to Mrs. Violet Carew, at the Ploughman's Rest where she had, to my considerable surprise, taken a room under her own name and to Dr. Fenwick. He also sent a telegram to Inspector Lestrade. The meeting was to take place at Polwarth House, in the study, at 4 o'clock. "You are bringing them all together," I said. "What? There are things that can only be understood in the presence of the people who enacted them," Holmes replied. I could tell you the full story sitting here, Watson, and you would understand it intellectually. But there are details, confirmations, corrections, the small additional truths that only emerge when the people involved are in the same room, that I still require. And Lestrade, coming primarily to listen. The matter of what charges are laid, and against whom, is more complicated than it might appear. Several of the parties involved have been both perpetrators and, in different senses, victims. Lestrade is a sensible man. He will use his judgment. 4 o'clock, in the study of Polwarth House, 5 of us assembled. Miss Eugenia Polwarth sat behind the desk that had been her brother's, erect and composed. Mrs. Violet Carew sat to one side of the fireplace in an attitude of careful stillness. I saw her eyes move to Holmes immediately upon his entrance, and remain there with a quality of assessment that was not hostile but not friendly. The look of a very intelligent person, determining how much they are faced with. Dr. Fenwick sat by the window, with the particular diminished quality of a man who has already confessed and is awaiting the accounting. Lestrade arrived. 4 minutes after the hour, rain-damp from the journey, installed himself in a corner chair with the professional neutrality he was actually rather good at when the occasion demanded it. Holmes stood in the centre of the room. He did not pace. He did not dramatise. He simply spoke. "Cornelius Polwarth did not die of cardiac failure on the 14th of November, he began. He died in his coffin in the churchyard of St. Ambrose's, sometime in the hours following his burial, as the effect of a sedative drug wore off. He died because the plan for his retrieval failed. This was not murder in the conventional sense. No one administered a mortal blow or a poison. It was, rather, fatal collapse of an elaborate scheme of false death, conceived by Mr. Polwarth himself, assisted by Mrs. Carew, made possible by Dr. Fenwick, I believe, known in outline, if not in all detail, by Miss Polwarth. He let the last point settle in the room. Mrs. Carew did not look away from him. Miss Polwarth's hands, folded on the desk, tightened by a fraction. "The scheme," Holmes continued, "conceived as an escape from debt and from the consequences of financial mismanagement that had been accumulating for years. Mr. Polwarth, unwilling to face bankruptcy, the loss of the estate, and the social destruction that would follow, chose instead to vanish. The mechanism was a drug known to produce a death-like torpor lasting several hours, administered to himself on the evening of the 14th. Dr. Fenwick was coerced into certifying the apparent death. The burial was expedited. A confederate was to open the grave in the hours following burial, before the drug wore off, and assist Polwarth to a waiting carriage. He and Mrs. Carew would then leave England, and the £1,200, Lestrade said, was Mrs. Carew's fee for her organisational role, to be collected from a fund Polwarth had been accumulating at Marsden and Co. The largest sum in that fund, closer to 4,000, was their joint capital for a new life abroad. Holmes paused. The plan failed because the man Mrs. Carew had engaged to perform the physical retrieval, digging open the grave in darkness, was himself intercepted. I believe he was seen by someone in the village, took fright and absconded. Mrs. Carew arrived later and found the grave undisturbed. She could not move the earth alone. By the time she had sought assistance, a matter of several hours, it was too late. Mrs. Carew had not moved, but something in her face, in the area below the eyes, was no longer held in place with the same precision. "Mrs. Carew," Holmes said, more quietly, "the man you engaged, who was he? A silence of perhaps 10 seconds. Then his name was Pritchard. He worked for a labour agency in Bermondsey. He had no idea what he was engaged for until he arrived. I had told him he was collecting an item from a storage site, and when the reality became apparent, he ran. Yes. You should have been here yourself, Holmes said, not as an accusation, with something close to sorrow. I know that, she said. Her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. Holmes turned to Miss Polwarth. You knew your brother intended to disappear. She met his eyes without flinching. He told me 3 weeks before. He told me the estate would pass to me, encumbered. Yes, but manageable over time. He told me he could not face what was coming, and that this was the only way. He did not tell me the precise mechanism. Her chin was lifted. I should have stopped him. I knew what I knew, and I said nothing, and I have to carry that. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Lestrade. Inspector, he said, I will leave the legal determination to you. The conspiracy to certify a false death is a criminal matter. The death itself was not homicidal in intent, though it was fatal in result. The persons most culpable in law are Dr. Fenwick, falsified the medical record, and Mrs. Carew, who devised and organised the mechanism. Miss Polwarth's knowledge was passive. He paused. Cornelius Polwarth's body should be exhumed and properly examined. His estate's debts should be addressed through proper channels. Truth of how he died should be on the record. Lestrade nodded, writing something in his notebook with the compact efficiency of a man who is used to reducing complicated situations to actionable facts. Mrs. Carew, Dr. Fenwick, I'll be wanting full statements, and I'll ask you both not to leave Harwick Hollow tonight. Mrs. Carew inclined her head. Fenwick stared at the floor. Holmes moved to the door and then stopped. One thing more, he said, for the record and because I think it is owed. He looked at Mrs. Carew. You went back to the churchyard. At midnight, when you knew help would not arrive in time, you went back and you stayed. He paused. I am not certain that is legally relevant, but I thought someone should say it. Chapter I. The exhumation and its evidence. The formal exhumation of Cornelius Polwarth took place 2 mornings later, under grey skies that neither rained nor relented, in the presence of Lestrade, Holmes, myself, Vicar, who looked as though he would very much rather not be there, and the Kentish constabulary in the form of 2 constables who kept a respectful distance from the proceedings. Holmes had brought a colleague from London, Dr. Ambrose Price, one of the foremost forensic pathologists then practising, whose work I had previously encountered in the written record, if not in person. He was a compact, precise man in his late 40s, who treated the matter with the professional seriousness it deserved, and the personal detachment that was necessary. Coffin, when it was raised from the earth of the Eastern Plot, was found to be in the condition that one would expect of a lead-lined casket after a fortnight in Kent clay, externally unchanged, sealed, and bearing no evidence of any attempt to open it from outside. The interior, however, told a different story. I will not record the full details, partly out of consideration for the reader, and partly because certain aspects of what we found belonged to a category of human experience that resists a purely clinical description. I will say that the examination confirmed the following: that Cornelius Polwarth had been alive at the time of interment, that the positions of certain extremities, and the condition of the hands, those same hands that Fenwick had seen and not spoken of, were consistent with a man who had regained consciousness, had attempted, for some period of time, to signal for assistance, and that the precise marks of the sedative drug were found in the chemical analysis that Price subsequently conducted in London. The cause of death was recorded as asphyxiation, secondary to burial while living, consequent to a conspiracy to simulate death. Holmes stood apart from the proceedings once the technical examination had begun, his back to the grave, looking out across the common land to the south. I went to stand beside him. "It is a strange thing," I said after a while. "It is," he agreed. He planned it so carefully. The coffin provision in the will, 4 years of preparation, the accumulated funds, and was undone by a hired labourer who lost his nerve, Holmes said. The elaborate structure failed at its simplest human point. He paused. "I find that I am not as remote from this as I would prefer to be, Watson. He was not a good man, in several respects. He was a financial coward who preferred to abandon his responsibilities rather than face them. He deceived his sister. He blackmailed his doctor. He involved an intelligent woman in a scheme that has destroyed the life she had rebuilt." He paused again. "And yet he lay in the dark and knocked on the lid of his coffin and waited for someone to come, and no one came. That is, not nothing. I did not answer, because there was no answer to give." After a while, Holmes straightened, buttoned his coat, and walked back toward where Lestrade was finishing his notes. "Come, Watson," he said. "There is still the matter of the money at Marsden & Co. Chapter 14. The account at Marsden & Co. The resolution of the account at Marsden & Co., Fleet Street, London, required one further day in the city, and a degree of coordination between Coordination Lestrade's office and the solicitors involved that was, frankly, less arduous than it might have been, primarily because Mrs. Violet Carew proved, in the end, to be a cooperative witness of considerable intelligence. She had, as Holmes had indicated, been both architect and victim of the scheme. Role was unquestionably criminal. She had procured a drug, engaged a labourer under false pretences, participated knowingly in the falsification of a death. She had also, by every measure of human behaviour that I could apply, been a woman genuinely attached to the man planned this with, and she had spent the night of his actual death attempting, in the cold and the dark, to reach him in time and failing. The law was not equipped to hold both of those facts in its hands simultaneously, and so it concerned itself primarily with the first. The matter of her prosecution was eventually settled. I will not detail the legal proceedings here, as they extended over several months and belong properly to another record, but her cooperation in establishing the full facts of the case was acknowledged as material mitigation. Dr. Fenwick, to his credit, resigned his practice before the matter came to formal hearing, and provided a sworn statement of complete candour. The medical council addressed his case in its own way. I do not know the final outcome. Holmes and I had by then moved on to other things. Miss Eugenia Polwarth retained Polwarth House, though at reduced circumstances. The estate's debts, once properly examined, proved to be less catastrophic than initially presented. Mr. Polwarth had, in his 4 years of preparation, been conducting a kind of financial theatre, as much as a genuine liquidation, and a significant portion of the recorded debt was to fictitious creditors of his own invention. It was, as Holmes observed, the most elaborate element of the plan. A man who wished to vanish, leaving behind a papier-mâché ruin, oppressive at a distance, and hollow on inspection. The money at Marsden & Co., full 4,000 and change, was recovered and applied against the legitimate debts. The password that released the account, Roper's letter had indicated, was the Copper Beech. Holmes was the one who presented it to the account manager, calm efficiency of a man who finds the symbolic resonance of the thing neither amusing nor poignant, but simply accurate. Copper Beech, under which Cornelius Polwarth lay buried. The tree he had named in his secret arrangement with Mrs. Carew. The tree whose roots, by the spring, would have reached the depth of the casket. There was a poem in it, somewhere. Holmes was not the person to find it. I, perhaps, was, but I kept it to myself. Chapter 15. The Aftermath at Baker Street. It was a fortnight after the events in Harwick Hollow, on a grey Saturday afternoon at Baker Street that differed from the morning of our departure only in the quality of the fog, that I sat across from Holmes by the fire and attempted to compose my written account of the case. Holmes himself was engaged in a chemical experiment of no immediately apparent purpose, paint, involving a solution of a vivid green colour that occasionally released a smell of sulphur into the room. Mrs. Hudson had opened the window, protest, and the smell of November London had entered to compete. "You are going to call it the case of the coffin that knocked from the inside," Holmes said without looking up from his apparatus. "How did you? You have written the title 3 times on your notepad and crossed it twice, which tells me you are committed to it, but uncertain of the punctuation. Use an M dash before from." I looked at the notepad. He was entirely correct. "You are watching me." "I am always watching, Watson. It requires no particular effort." He adjusted the heat beneath the flask. "Does the account capture the essential mechanism adequately?" "I believe so, though I confess I am uncertain how to present certain elements. The sympathy question, particularly. Sympathy for whom? For all of them, different measures. Polwarth was a coward and a schemer, but he died badly and alone. Mrs. Carew acted illegally, but with what appears to have been genuine feeling. And she tried to correct the failure when it occurred. Fenwick was weak and corrupt, but was himself a victim of coercion. Even Miss Polwarth, who stood by while something unconscionable was set in motion, was protecting a brother she was too proud to say she loved." Holmes was quiet for a moment. The green solution bubbled gently. "The difficulty with human cases," he said, eventually, "as opposed to purely logical puzzles, is precisely what you have identified. In a pure logical problem, the variables are clean. In a human case, the variables are made of grief and fear, and misplaced loyalty, and very poor judgment, and they resist clean resolution." He looked up. "I do not think you should soften the account, port what happened, and let the reader reach their own sympathies. That is the honest approach." "And the knocking?" I said. "How do you account for it now, with everything known?" "The regular, patient knocking that Dobbins described. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more." Holmes set down his instrument and turned to face me fully. "The drug wore off over a period of time, rather than all at once. He would have surfaced gradually. First, from deep unconsciousness to something less deep, a state where physical action was possible before full awareness returned. The instinct to knock, to signal, to communicate presence, is one of the most fundamental that exists. He knocked the way a man knocks on a door, not in panic, the expectation of an answer. He paused. He expected in those first moments that the plan was proceeding, that someone was coming. The regular rhythm was not resignation. It was the rhythm of a man who still believed he would be heard. The green solution had ceased to bubble. Fire cracked. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows of Baker Street with its characterless, patient grey. "There is one thing I have not put in the account," I said, "because I am not certain it belongs there. Tell me anyway. Mrs. Carew, the churchyard in the dark. You said she stayed." I looked at him. "How do you know that? You weren't there." Holmes turned back to his experiment. "The mud on her boots when she sat in the study at Polwarth House was of the specific chalk clay composition found only in the eastern section of that churchyard. It was on both boots, and had reached above the ankle. Consistent with prolonged standing, not merely passage. She had been there for some time, and there was a separate streak across the left knee of her dress of the same earth. Consistent with someone who had knelt, quiet for a moment. She knelt in the dark and put her ear to the ground and listened. I had no reply to that, and so I made none. After a while, Holmes said, The green solution is not behaving as I expected, which either means my hypothesis about the compound was wrong, the compound is more interesting than I thought. He sounded, for the first time in the conversation, genuinely pleased. I suspect the latter. I turned back to my notes and wrote the title, without the crossings out, at the top of a clean page. Sherlock Holmes and the Coffin that knocked from the inside. Below it, as an epigraph, I wrote 3 words, and then changed my mind and wrote 4. He expected to be heard. Chapter 16's. A remark on vanishing Holmes made only one further observation on the matter, and he made it several weeks later, entirely without preamble. In the middle of a breakfast he was, for once, actually eating. He set down his toast, looked out of the window at the street below, and said, "The particular tragedy of Polwarth's scheme was not that it failed. Great many schemes fail. The particular tragedy was that it nearly worked." I looked up from my paper. Nearly? Pritchard had not lost his nerve. If Mrs. Carew had arrived an hour earlier, if the drug had acted with the precision they had calculated, he picked up his toast again. He would have been extracted, conveyed to a port, and been on a boat to the continent before morning. Within a week he would have been Cornelius somebody else, in a city where no one knew him. His debts would have been left behind. His sister would have had the house and the complication of his false death, but she would have managed. She is, as you know, a woman entirely capable of managing. He paused. And the world would have one more invisible man in it, living quietly somewhere between Bruges and Geneva, growing old under a name he had invented, watched over by a very competent woman who loved him better than he deserved. "You find that an acceptable outcome?" I asked, with some surprise. Holmes considered. "I find it a human outcome, which is not the same thing as an acceptable one, but is not entirely the opposite either." He looked at me. "The law exists to adjudicate between what is acceptable and what is not. My function is to establish what actually happened. 2 endeavours are related, but not identical." He returned to his toast. "In any case it is moot. The plan failed, and failure, in matters of this kind, tends to be absolute." He said nothing more on the subject. I recorded it here, as I have recorded everything in this account, because the remark struck me then, and strikes me still, as the most precise and unsentimental summary, the entire affair that could have been offered, and because it was characteristic of the man that he offered it over breakfast, between bites of toast, as though it were merely one more observation about the world, and its persistent tendency to be what it is, rather than what its inhabitants intend. The case of the coffin that knocked from the inside was closed. Another would open within the week. It always did. Here ends the account, as recorded by Dr. John H. Watson, M.D., late of the Army Medical Department, sometime companion to Mr. Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective, Baker Street, London.